Venezuela is a country of paradox. It sits on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, over 300 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada. And yet, in the last decade, it became one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. How does that happen? For years, the warning signs were there. The state spent far more than it earned, borrowing against future oil revenue instead of reinvesting in production. Refineries aged, infrastructure decayed, foreign expertise was pushed out, and corruption, systemic, not incidental, became a substitute for planning. Economically, it was like having a fridge full of food, but never cooking a meal. Just toast and butter every day, while everything else spoiled. Under Hugo Chavez, oil income was used to fund massive social programs, but without reinvestment. When oil prices were high, the system survived. When prices fell, it collapsed. By the time Nicolas Maduro took over in 2013, the economy was already fragile. What followed turned fragility into disaster. Inflation exploded. By 2018, Venezuela entered hyperinflation. Prices were rising not by tens or hundreds of percent, but by hundreds of thousands, at times over 1 million% per year. Salaries became meaningless, savings were wiped out, cash itself became useless. Oil production collapsed. From more than 3.2 million barrels per day in the early 2000s, production fell below 500,000 barrels per day at its lowest point. Skilled workers left. Equipment rusted. Sanctions later compounded the damage. But the decline began long before them. The human cost was staggering. An estimated 7 to 8 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the population, left the country, fleeing not war, but economic suffocation. It became the largest migration crisis in modern Latin American history. Poverty soared. At its worst point, over 90% of households lived in poverty. Hospitals ran without power. Children fainted in classrooms from hunger. Politically, the system hardened. Maduro lost legitimacy at the ballot box. But instead of stepping aside, elections were postponed, invalidated, or restructured. Power was concentrated. Courts were neutralized. Parliament was sidelined. A small clique of military leaders and loyal officials was rewarded, insulated, protected. The rest of the country was left to drift. Then came the allegations. U.S. prosecutors accused senior Venezuelan figures of involvement in drug trafficking, alleging that cocaine shipments moved through Venezuelan territory toward the United States. Whether driven by greed, corruption, or desperation, the claim was that illicit flows became a substitute for lost oil revenue. For Washington, Venezuela became more than a humanitarian tragedy. It became a strategic problem. At the same time, energy prices mattered more than ever. The global economy, many economists argue, struggles when oil prices stay much above $50 per barrel. Lower energy prices ripple through everything: transport, food, manufacturing. And in the U.S., despite increased domestic production, consumers still hadn't seen the dramatic price relief they expected. From Donald Trump's perspective, the logic was blunt. If energy prices fall, inflation falls. If inflation falls, voters feel it. And if oil supply increases significantly, global leverage shifts.
You get energy prices down, which we're doing.
That logic extended far beyond Venezuela. Russia, for example, depends heavily on oil and gas revenue. Analysts estimate Russia's federal budget balances only when oil prices are around $60 per barrel or higher. If prices fall to $40, Russia loses tens of billions of dollars annually, making prolonged war far harder to sustain. At $40 oil, wars become expensive very quickly. Meanwhile, the United States also wanted to reduce dependence on China, especially for critical materials and supply chains. Stabilizing Europe, ending the war in Ukraine, and reshaping energy flows all pointed in the same direction: cheap, abundant energy. That's where Venezuela re-entered the picture. If Venezuela were realigned, politically and economically, its oil could re-enter global markets at scale. Refineries in the U.S. Gulf Coast are already designed for Venezuelan crude. Production could rise within months, not decades. The ripple effects would be enormous. Lower oil prices globally, pressure on Russia, relief for American consumers, less leverage for China, and in Latin America, a major shift. Venezuela has long supported Cuba, supplying subsidized oil. A realignment would weaken Havana's last major lifeline. The geopolitical map of the region would tilt. From Washington's perspective, this wasn't about ideology, it was about systems. Other oil states, particularly in the Gulf, had shown what happens when countries integrate into global markets, reduce corruption, reinvest in production, and work with U.S. firms. They became rich. Their populations benefited. The state collected taxes. Business expanded. Venezuela could do the same. But one obstacle remained. Maduro, he was pressured, sanctioned, declared illegitimate, offered off-ramps. At times, he signaled willingness to cooperate, but from Washington's view, time was running out. Midterm elections loomed. Political windows closed quickly. Restarting Venezuelan oil production would take months, not weeks. If results were to be felt by voters, action had to come early. From this perspective, the conclusion hardened. If Venezuela was to change course, if oil was to flow, if prices were to fall, if wars were to become unsustainable, then the system at the top had to change. And in that entire structure, in that entire web of consequences, everything came down to one man still standing in the way. Once it was clear that Maduro would not step aside voluntarily, the question was no longer whether he would go, but how to remove him without plunging the country into chaos. According to U.S. officials and subsequent media reporting, the operation was built around a simple principle: nothing could be allowed to respond. The first actions were not aimed at the president himself. They were aimed at the systems that could interfere. In the opening phase, U.S. forces struck a small number of key military and monitoring sites. Installations linked, according to officials, to air surveillance, early warning, and air defense coordination. These were not population centers. They were functional nodes. The purpose, as described later, was to ensure that Venezuelan forces could not see clearly, coordinate quickly, or respond coherently to what was coming next. Only once indicators suggested those capabilities were neutralized did the operation move forward. At that point, U.S. aircraft entered Venezuelan airspace in large numbers. Reporting describes a layered presence, advanced fighter aircraft and support platforms, whose role was not to attack the city, but to control the sky. If anything remained capable of firing upward, this was the phase designed to expose it. The objective was simple: clear the way. With airspace effectively uncontested, helicopters followed. They moved toward Caracas, toward a location U.S. officials say they already knew with high confidence. According to reporting, American intelligence had tracked Maduro's movements for a long time, using a combination of surveillance and human sources. For years, the U.S. had also offered multi-million-dollar rewards for information leading to his arrest, incentives that historically fracture loyalty inside tightly controlled regimes. It is widely assumed, though never officially confirmed, that by this point key figures within his security environment chose not to resist. The logic was brutally clear. Stand by an internationally isolated leader wanted by the United States and become a target yourself, or step aside, preserve position, or leave quietly. When the helicopters arrived, resistance was minimal. Media reports mention isolated small arms fire, but no coordinated defense, no organized response, and no attempt to contest the airspace. Inside the residence, Maduro was taken by surprise. Reporting does not describe a bunker or a last stand. On the contrary, accounts suggest he was not behind hardened defenses and that the encounter was brief. He and his wife were detained in the private area of the residence, caught before he could retreat to more secure protection. There was no prolonged confrontation. They were given time to dress, restrained, and removed. From that moment on, the operation shifted immediately to extraction. Within hours, Maduro was no longer on Venezuelan soil. Once he crossed that threshold, the balance of power moved with him, out of the country. He was transferred into U.S. custody and later flown to New York, where American authorities said he would face charges, including narcotics-related offenses. And then, something telling happened. Nothing else did. There were no foreign troops occupying streets, no new rulers announced on television, no tanks rolling through Caracas. The city woke up confused, but intact. That silence pointed to the final, decisive element. The United States did not intend to govern Venezuela directly. That would require an army, an administration, and endless responsibility. Instead, officials signaled that understandings had already been reached, with military, administrative, and economic figures who remained in place once the president was gone. In other words, the operation did not end with the helicopters. It ended because the system underneath did not resist. That is what made it a diplomatic success as much as a military one, an intelligence success as much as a technical one. When the man at the center was removed, the structure held, not because it was strong, but because the loyalties had already shifted. And that is why this did not look like a coup, or an invasion, or a civil war. It looked like a country waking up after the decision had already been made. Venezuela appears back to normal, with its oil now redirected to the United States and cut off from Russia and China. American refiners benefit, and U.S. consumers may see slightly lower fuel costs. But even if Venezuela expands production to around 1.4 million barrels per day from 1.1 million within 1 year, realistically, that's still a small fraction of the roughly 100 million barrels the world consumes daily. In other words, Venezuelan output helps, but it won't dramatically lower prices at home on its own. Oil is only one part of inflation. How to truly reduce U.S. consumer prices is a bigger question, one for our next video, by God's help.